The dense canopy of ancient oaks cast long shadows across the forest floor, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead like arthritic fingers. Dr. Isabel Wright pushed through the undergrowth, her boots sinking into the damp earth with each step. The air hung heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and moss, a primordial perfume that seemed to whisper of secrets long buried. Isabel paused, consulting the weathered map in her hands. The parchment was brittle, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. She had discovered it tucked away in the dusty archives of Miskatonic University, a tantalizing clue to the whereabouts of a forgotten chapel that had once been the subject of hushed legends and fearful whispers. As a historian specializing in obscure religious sites, Isabel had encountered her fair share of dead ends and disappointments. But something about this particular mystery had captivated her from the moment she first stumbled upon the fragmentary records. The Chapel of St. Elias, they called it, a place of miracles and terror, hope and despair. The village of Briar Hollow lay behind her, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled against the encroaching wilderness. The locals had been less than forthcoming when she inquired about the chapel. Old Mabel, the innkeeper, had fixed Isabel with a rheumy stare and muttered, "Some things are best left forgotten, dearie. That chapel ain't nothing but trouble." But Isabel was not one to be deterred by superstition or vague warnings. She had come too far to turn back now. As she pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The light grew dim, filtered through layers of leaves until it took on a sickly greenish hue. Isabel's breath quickened, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. And then, quite suddenly, she saw it. The chapel stood in a small clearing, its stone walls nearly obscured by a thick blanket of ivy and moss. The structure was smaller than Isabel had imagined, barely larger than a cottage. Its roof had partially collapsed, allowing tendrils of vegetation to infiltrate the interior. A heavy wooden door, reinforced with rusted iron bands, barred the entrance. Isabel approached cautiously, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As she drew closer, she noticed strange symbols carved into the stone around the doorway, a curious blend of Christian iconography and older, more arcane designs that she didn't recognize. She reached out to brush away some of the clinging vines, revealing more of the intricate carvings. As her fingers made contact with the cold stone, a jolt of electricity seemed to course through her body. Isabel stumbled back, gasping. For a moment, just the briefest of instants, she could have sworn she heard a whisper, a sibilant voice carried on the wind. "Welcome, Seeker," it seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you." Isabel shook her head, trying to clear the fog that had suddenly descended upon her mind. It was just her imagination, surely, the product of too many hours poring over dusty tomes and fanciful legends. She withdrew a small notebook from her backpack and began to sketch the chapel's exterior, making careful notes about its architecture and the unusual symbols adorning its walls. As she worked, the sense of being watched grew stronger, an almost palpable weight pressing down upon her. The light was fading rapidly now, the forest plunging into an unnatural twilight. Isabel knew she should head back to the village before full dark, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She found herself drawn to the heavy wooden door, her hand reaching out of its own accord to trace the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. As her fingers brushed against a particularly ornate symbol, a twisted serpentine shape that seemed to writhe beneath her touch, there was a sudden ear-splitting crack. Isabel leapt back as the door swung open with a groan of protesting hinges, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. The musty odor of age and decay wafted out, carrying with it a hint of something else, something acrid and unnatural that made Isabel's eyes water. She hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But the lure of discovery was too strong to resist. With trembling hands, Isabel switched on her flashlight and stepped into the chapel's gloomy interior. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing scenes of incredible beauty and unspeakable horror. The walls were covered in frescoes, their colors still vibrant despite the passage of centuries. But as Isabel's gaze traveled across the images, her breath caught in her throat. What at first glance appeared to be scenes of divine rapture revealed themselves to be something far more sinister upon closer inspection. Figures writhed in ecstasy or agony. It was impossible to tell which, their faces contorted into masks of inhuman bliss. And looming over it all, a dark, featureless entity that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Isabel's flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker as she moved deeper into the chapel. The air grew colder, a clammy chill that seeped into her bones. She could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, like the beating of a colossal heart, emanating from somewhere beneath her feet. At the far end of the chapel stood an altar, its surface stained dark with what Isabel prayed was merely the patina of age. As she approached, her flashlight sputtered and died, plunging her into total darkness. Panic clawed at her throat as Isabel fumbled in her pocket for matches. Her fingers closed around the small box, and she struck a match with trembling hands. The tiny flame cast grotesque shadows on the walls, making the painted figures seem to dance and writhe. And then she saw it, a trapdoor set into the floor before the altar, its edges barely visible beneath years of grime and neglect. Without thinking, Isabel reached down to brush away the debris, her curiosity overriding her fear. As her fingers made contact with the cold metal of the trapdoor's handle, a jolt of energy surged through her body. Isabel's vision swam, the chapel dissolving around her in a kaleidoscope of nightmarish images. She saw the chapel as it once was, filled with light and the fervent prayers of pilgrims seeking miracles. She saw a gaunt priest with burning eyes, his hands raised in supplication before the altar. And she saw something else, a presence so vast and alien that her mind recoiled from its very existence. The vision lasted only a moment, but when it cleared, Isabel found herself on her knees, gasping for breath. The match had burned down to her fingers, singeing her skin, but she hardly noticed the pain. With shaking hands, she lit another match and forced herself to look at the trapdoor once more. There, etched into its surface, was a symbol she recognized from her research, the seal of an ancient and terrible entity, one whose name was spoken only in the most forbidden of texts. Isabel scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had to get out, had to warn someone of what she had discovered. But as she turned to flee, she found her path blocked. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light of the forest beyond. For a moment, Isabel thought it was one of the villagers, come to check on her. Then the figure stepped forward, and Isabel's scream died in her throat. It was the priest from her vision, his face a mask of ecstatic reverence. But his eyes were not human. They blazed with an eldritch light, ancient and hungry. "Welcome, child," he said, his voice a sibilant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been waiting for you for so very long." The last match sputtered and died, plunging Isabel into darkness. And in that darkness, something stirred, something vast and terrible and patient. The forgotten chapel had claimed another seeker, and the cycle began anew. Isabel's heart thundered in her chest as she stood frozen before the apparition of the priest. His eyes, twin pools of eldritch fire, bored into her very soul. The darkness of the chapel seemed to pulse around them, alive with malevolent intent. "Who? What are you?" Isabel managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. The priest's lips curled into a smile that was at once beatific and terrifying. "I am Father Elias, child. Or rather, I was. Now I am so much more." He gestured with a skeletal hand, and suddenly the chapel was illuminated by an otherworldly glow emanating from the walls themselves. Isabel's eyes darted around, taking in the nightmarish frescoes with newfound clarity. What she had initially mistaken for scenes of religious ecstasy now revealed themselves to be depictions of unspeakable rituals. Figures writhed in agony, their bodies contorting as they were consumed by a darkness that seemed to leap off the walls. "You've come seeking knowledge," Father Elias continued, his voice a hypnotic drone. "But are you prepared for the truth, Dr. Wright? The truth that lies beneath this holy ground?" Isabel took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the trapdoor. She stumbled, nearly losing her balance. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, trying to keep the fear from her voice. The priest laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We know all who are drawn to this place, your curiosity, your thirst for understanding. It calls to us across the veil of time and space. As he spoke, the trapdoor beneath Isabel's feet began to vibrate, a low hum that she felt in her bones. Against her will, she found her gaze drawn downward. The seal etched into the metal seemed to writhe and pulse, its lines blurring and reforming into impossible geometries. "What's down there?" Isabel asked, though a part of her dreaded the answer. Father Elias's eyes gleamed with an unholy light. "The source of all miracles," he intoned. "The wellspring of power that has drawn pilgrims to this chapel for centuries. Would you like to see it, Dr. Wright? To understand the true nature of faith and sacrifice?" Before Isabel could respond, the trapdoor flew open with a thunderous crash. A gust of frigid air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying with it the stench of decay and something far older, a primordial odor that spoke of vast, lightless spaces and things that should not be. Isabel stumbled back, but invisible hands seemed to grasp at her, pulling her inexorably towards the yawning pit. She clawed desperately at the stone floor, her nails breaking as she sought purchase. "No!" she screamed. "Let me go!" Father Elias watched impassively as Isabel was dragged towards the opening. "Fear not, child," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You are about to become part of something greater than yourself. Embrace the darkness, and you will know truths beyond mortal ken." With a final terrified shriek, Isabel plummeted into the abyss. She fell for what seemed like an eternity, tumbling through a void that defied all logic and reason. Flashes of otherworldly vistas assaulted her senses. Vast, cyclopean cities that predated humanity. Writhing tentacles that stretched across the gulfs between stars, and always, the sense of an immense malevolent presence watching her descent. When Isabel finally hit the ground, it was with a bone-jarring impact that should have shattered her body. But as she lay there, gasping for breath in the oppressive darkness, she realized that she was somehow unharmed. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. The air around her was thick and humid, carrying strange, discordant whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Isabel fumbled in her pocket for her phone, praying that it had survived the fall. To her amazement, the screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over her surroundings. She found herself in a vast, cavernous space, its walls slick with some sort of phosphorescent fungus that pulsed in time with the whispers. And there, in the center of the cavern, stood an altar far larger and more terrible than the one above. It was a massive slab of obsidian, its surface carved with symbols that hurt Isabel's eyes to look upon. Atop the altar lay a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run to find a way out of this nightmare, Isabel found herself drawn towards the altar. The whispers grew louder as she approached, resolving into words in a language she had never heard before but somehow understood. "Radam," they urged, "no, become." With trembling hands, Isabel reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with dense, spidery writing, interspersed with diagrams of such cosmic horror that she felt her sanity begin to fray at the edges, but she couldn't stop reading. The words seemed to burn themselves into her mind, revealing truths about the nature of reality that no human was meant to comprehend. She learned of the great old ones, beings of unimaginable power that slumbered in the void between worlds. She learned of the cult that had built this chapel, using it as a lure to draw in unsuspecting souls to feed their slumbering god. And she learned of her own role in this cosmic drama, a vessel carefully prepared over centuries to serve as the key to awakening that which slept below. Isabel don't know how long she stood there, absorbing forbidden knowledge. It could have been hours or days or millennia. Time had no meaning in this place beyond time. When she finally tore her gaze away from the book, she found that she was no longer alone in the cavern. Figures emerged from the shadows, the missing pilgrims, their bodies twisted and changed by whatever power dwelled in this unholy place. Their eyes glowed with the same eldritch fire as Father Elias's, and they moved with an unnatural grace that spoke of something more than human. At their head stood Father Elias himself, his skeletal form now wreathed in tendrils of living shadow. He spread his arms wide, a gesture both welcoming and terrifying. "Do you understand now, Dr. Wright?" he asked, his voice resonating with otherworldly power. "Do you see the glorious purpose for which you were chosen?" Isabel wanted to scream, to deny everything she had learned. But the knowledge burned within her, reshaping her very being. She could feel something vast and ancient stirring in the depths of her mind, its consciousness slowly intertwining with her own. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice strange and distant to her own ears. "I understand." Father Elias's face split in a rictus grin. "Then let us begin the awakening. The stars are right, and he who slumbers shall rise once more." The cultists began to chant, their voices rising in a cacophony that shook the very foundations of the earth. Isabel felt herself being lifted, her body floating towards the great obsidian altar. She knew she should resist, should fight against what was happening. But a part of her, a part that was growing stronger with each passing moment, embraced it. As she was laid upon the cold stone, Isabel caught a glimpse of her reflection in its polished surface. Her eyes now burned with the same eldritch fire as the others, and patterns of otherworldly symbols had begun to etch themselves into her skin. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and Isabel felt something vast and terrible begin to stir beneath her. The cavern shook, rocks tumbling from the ceiling as reality itself seemed to warp and bend. In that moment, as the veil between worlds grew thin, Isabel made a choice. With the last vestiges of her humanity, she reached out and grasped the forbidden book. If she was to be a vessel for this cosmic horror, then she would use the knowledge it had given her to fight back. Summoning every ounce of will she possessed, Isabel began to recite a counter-ritual, her voice rising above the chants of the cultists. The words burned her throat, tasting of ash and starfire. But she pressed on. Father Elias's eyes widened in shock and rage. "No!" he screamed, lunging towards her. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion." But it was too late. The air around Isabel began to shimmer and distort, a vortex of energy swirling around her prone form. She could feel the presence in her mind recoiling, shrieking in fury as it was torn away. The last thing Isabel saw before consciousness fled was the cavern collapsing around her, burying the cultists and their blasphemous altar beneath tons of rock and earth. Then darkness claimed her, and she knew no more. When Isabel awoke, she found herself lying on the forest floor outside the ruined chapel. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the horrors she had witnessed. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Her clothes were tattered and stained, and her skin bore faint tracings of symbols that were already beginning to fade. The chapel stood silent and empty, its door hanging open on broken hinges. Whatever power had dwelled within seemed to have dissipated, leaving behind only crumbling stone and the weight of centuries. Isabel knew she should feel relieved, triumphant even. She had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious. But as she stood on shaky legs and began the long trek back to civilization, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The knowledge she had gained in that dark place below the earth burned within her, a constant reminder of truths too terrible to contemplate. And somewhere in the vast gulfs between the stars, she knew that ancient eyes had opened, aware now of her existence and hungry for the power she possessed. As Isabel stumbled through the forest, her mind reeling from all she had experienced, she made a silent vow. She would use what she had learned to protect humanity from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a terrifying truth. In her quest for knowledge, she had opened a door that could never truly be closed again. The weeks following Isabel's harrowing escape from the forgotten chapel passed in a haze of fevered nightmares and waking terrors. She had returned to her small apartment in Arkham, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw visions of vast alien landscapes and heard the whispers of things that should not be. The symbols that had marked her skin had faded, but their memory remained etched in her mind. Isabel found herself absently tracing their patterns on any available surface. Notepads, steamed-up mirrors, even the condensation on her water glass. Each time, she felt a surge of otherworldly energy, a connection to something vast and incomprehensible. Her colleagues at Miskatonic University had noticed the change in her. Once passionate and driven, Isabel now moved through the halls like a ghost, her eyes haunted and distant. She had tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in her throat. How could she describe the horrors she had witnessed without sounding mad? And so, Isabel retreated into her research, poring over ancient tomes and forbidden texts with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She was searching for something. Answers, perhaps, or a way to undo what had been done. But with each page she turned, each arcane secret she uncovered, she felt herself slipping further from the world she had once known. It was on a cold, moonless night in late autumn that everything changed. Isabel sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of books and crumpled papers covered in her increasingly erratic handwriting. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy she had come to recognize all too well. As she reached for another tome, her hand brushed against the leather-bound journal she had been using to record her findings. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her body, and suddenly, the room around her seemed to dissolve. Isabel found herself standing once more in the cavern beneath the chapel, but it was different now. The walls pulsed with an otherworldly light, and the air was filled with a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Before her stood the obsidian altar, and upon it lay a figure that made her blood run cold. It was herself, or rather, a version of herself. Eyes closed, body rigid, as if in death. But even as Isabel watched, horrified, she saw her doppelganger's chest rise and fall with slow, deliberate breaths. "You cannot escape your destiny, Dr. Wright," a familiar voice echoed through the cavern. Father Elias emerged from the shadows, his form now more shadow than substance. The ritual may have been interrupted, but the connection was made. You are the key, the bridge between worlds. Isabel tried to back away, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "No," she whispered. "This isn't real. I stopped it. I escaped." Father Elias's laughter was a sound of breaking reality. "Escaped? My dear, you merely delayed the inevitable. The Great Old One has tasted your mind, and it hungers for more. Even now it reaches across the void, drawn by the knowledge you carry." As if in response to his words, the air around them began to ripple and distort. Isabel felt a presence pressing against the fabric of reality, vast, ancient, and utterly alien. It was the same presence she had sensed in the depths of the chapel, but now it felt stronger, more focused. With a sound like the tearing of the universe itself, a rift began to open above the altar. Through it, Isabel caught glimpses of a realm beyond human comprehension. Cyclopean cities of non-Euclidean geometry, seas of writhing darkness, and always, the sense of something watching, waiting. "Behold," Father Elias intoned, his voice filled with reverent awe. "The awakening begins." Isabel wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But as the rift widened, she felt something within her respond. The knowledge she had gained, the power she had touched. It all surged to the surface, drawn inexorably towards the cosmic horror that sought entry into our world. In that moment of terror and realization, Isabel made a choice. If she could not escape her destiny, perhaps she could shape it. Drawing upon every scrap of forbidden lore she had uncovered in her fevered research, she began to chant. The words that poured from her lips were not human, nor were they of any earthly language. They were the syllables of creation and destruction, of realities beyond mortal ken. As she spoke, Isabel felt her very being begin to unravel, her consciousness expanding beyond the confines of her physical form. Father Elias's exultant expression turned to one of horror. "What are you doing?" he shrieked, his form beginning to dissolve like smoke in a strong wind. "You'll doom us all." But Isabel paid him no heed. Her voice rose to a crescendo, and with a final, reality-shattering word, she flung her expanded consciousness into the rift. For an eternal instant, Isabel Wright ceased to exist as a singular entity. She became one with the cosmic forces that swirled through the void, her mind touching the vast intellect of the Great Old One itself. In that touch, she understood truths that would drive lesser minds to madness: the illusory nature of time and space, the insignificance of humanity in the grand tapestry of the cosmos, and the terrible, beautiful cycle of creation and destruction that governed all existence. And then, with a thunderous implosion, the rift closed. Isabel found herself once more in her apartment, sprawled on the floor amidst scattered papers and overturned books. Her body felt strange, as if it no longer quite fit the consciousness that inhabited it. As she struggled to her feet, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and faint shimmering patterns played across her skin. No longer the crude symbols of before, but intricate designs that spoke of realities beyond human comprehension. She had changed, irrevocably and profoundly. In the days that followed, Isabel tried to resume some semblance of a normal life, but she knew, deep in her transformed being, that nothing would ever be the same. The knowledge she had gained, the power she now wielded, it set her apart from the world she had once known. She found she could perform feats that defied the laws of physics, manipulating reality itself with a thought. But with this power came a terrible burden. Isabel could sense the thinness of the veil between worlds, could feel the constant pressure of things seeking entry into our reality, and so she appointed herself guardian of that fragile barrier. Using her newfound abilities, Isabel traveled the globe, seeking out places of power like the Forgotten Chapel, weak points where the cosmic horrors might break through. She sealed rifts, banished entities, and did what she could to protect a world that would never know the dangers that lurked just beyond perception. But in her quieter moments, when the weight of her responsibility threatened to crush her, Isabel wondered, had she truly won that night in the cavern? Or had she merely postponed the inevitable? For in her dreams, she still heard the whispers of the Great Old One, and she knew that one day it would call her home. As she stood atop a windswept cliff, gazing out at a sea that roiled with more than just earthly storms, Isabel Wright, once a simple historian, now something far more, contemplated the nature of her existence. She was no longer fully human, but neither was she one of the cosmic entities she had touched. She existed in between, a bridge between realities, forever altered by her brush with forces beyond mortal comprehension. And in the vast, uncaring cosmos, something stirred. Ancient eyes turned once more towards the tiny blue planet that had produced such an intriguing anomaly. The game was not over. It had merely entered a new phase. The Forgotten Chapel may have crumbled to dust, but its legacy lived on in the transformed being that was once Isabel Wright. The wheel of cosmic horror continued to turn, and somewhere in the depths of space and time a dark god smiled.